In the first slide, I'm gonna explain to you what is humanitarian intervention or the definition of humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention is defined as the uninvited interference by a state, states, or international organization in the domestic affairs of another state to prevent and human rights abuses. This should not be confused with peacekeeping activities, which usually take place with the agreement of the parties involved in order to sustain a peace which has already been reached. It's also different from interventions which yield humanitarian collateral benefits. U.S. intervention in Afghanistan in the wake of the 2001 terrorist attacks, for example, may have liberated the Afghan people from the Taliban and impending starvation. However, humanitarianism was not the primary goal of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, but rather national security. And for the second slide, are human intervention justified? First, advocates of humanitarian intervention come mainly from a liberal perspective, arguing that states forfeit their sovereignty rights when they violate or fail to protect the basic rights of their citizens. While able to make occasional exceptions, they generally encourage actions to take place under the auspices of international organizations such as the United Nations, as the system enhances transparency and eliminates potential for violence. Second is, opponents of humanitarian intervention, often reflecting a realist perspective, believe that sovereignty should remain a principle of international order. The primary obligation of states is to the interests and well-being of their own citizens, not that of the citizens of other states. Therefore, no matter how admirable the principle of humanitarian action is in theory, it will in fact become another tool for the wealthy to enforce their will and values. Since the UN is merely about another arena for power politics rather than an alternative, its participation will not solve the problem of abuse. Types of intervention. First is unilateral intervention, uninvited interference in the affairs of another state by a state or small group of states, without the consent of or authorization of a broader international organization such as the United Nations. Second is multilateral intervention, uninvited interference by many nations in the domestic affairs of another state with the approval or sanction of a legitimate international organization such as the United Nations. The right to intervene. Would the forfeiture of one state's constitutional right automatically grant others the right to intervene? The answer is not directly. The right of intervention stems not from the loss of sovereignty by the target state, but from the rights of those abused. Thus, the right to interfere is a logical extension of a concept that practically no one rejects, that individuals and groups within nations are entitled to resist when their rights are abused, particularly when their own government is the perpetrator.
Is humanitarian intervention legal? There is no consensus over the legality of intervention, in part because there is not consensus over the source of international law. More general, the intervention problem is inseparable from the question that have been at the heart of international law for country, and that we cannot expect to answer is humanitarian intervention legal or not, something like that, because in order to reconcile the different views of humanitarian intervention, The legality of humanitarianism is therefore contingent. One theory of how law works and changes. The law may well be incoherent and it may be unable to distinguish between complaints and no complaints. But it remains political powerful and therefore important. The challenge for a scholar is to explain how it is that the commitment to the rule of law consists with this fundamental ambiguity. Next slide. Between legality and legality. The difference between the two set of view rests on how one understands the relation of international law to state behavior. The argument for illegality is constructed by reading the UN Charter, and after finding the answer to the question there in black letter law. It results in conclusion based on the propriety of state consent and treaty law over other legal resources such as parties, custom, and so on. It suggests that state parties that contradict a place of treaty law should be condemned as non-compliance, and that the political, moral, or transformational motives behind it are relevant. Thank you.
So, yeah, the humanitarian intervention of the UN. Founded in 1945, the United Nations seeks to provide peace, security, and justice. One way that is try to achieve this goal is through humanitarian interventions. The UN has agreed on three principles of humanitarian interventions: using military force, interfering interfering in the internal affairs of the target country, and responding to crises where the country's interests are not directly threatened. So, to get the green light, the UN asks the Security Council to authorize military forces. When the post-Cold War era in 1990 and 2000 experienced an increase in non-military threats, including growth and systematic human rights violations, and barriers to sending humanitarian aid. The United Nations saw the situation of Somalia and Rwanda as a threat to the international world, peace and security. Somalia became one of the first countries where the Security Council dirtied their hands. In 1991, when the old Somali dictator Saad Barre was overthrown in a coup, there was a struggle for power among various warlords who fought to gain control of the government. In addition, several drew the threatens starvation with fighting in the capital Mogadishu, and conditions very difficult to deliver food. The Security Council declared Somalia's deteriorating humanitarian situation a threat to international peace and security. Because at that time the UN does not have its own troops, the Security Council must rely on the troops of the member states, such as we face a delay in implementing military action in both cases. In addition, In both cases, the troops well were not well equipped. The slide 2 is responsibility to protect, or R2P. Stemming from failures in Somalia and Rwanda, the United Nations switched from a humanitarian intervention policy to the one of the responsibilities to protect, or R2P, in 2005. R2P has three elements. The state is responsible for protecting its citizens from mass human rights violations. The second is, if the state cannot protect its own citizens, the state must ask the international community for help. And the last is that if the state fails to protect its citizens and peaceful action fail, the R2P gives responsibility to the international community to intervene with technical support, followed by military action as a last resort. And the last slide is the United Nations formed after World War II to promote peace and stability, recognize the importance of sovereignty, especially for newly independent states or those seeking independence from invaders. The UN Charter says nothing contained in this charter will authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters that are essentially in the domestic jurisdiction of any state. This principle does not rule out the application of law enforcement measures. There are cases to peace, violation of peace, or acts of aggression on the part of the state. Beyond operational and political questions, military intervention also involves legal issues and also Russia and China have historically been reluctant to support all forms of intervention. That's the factor that causes a dilemma in interventions. It cannot be explained by a single factor, whether the UN intervenes or doesn't intervene in a humanitarian crisis. Rather, this variation in UN action largely accounts for a combination of conditions: the extent of human suffering, the level of spillover effect, the military strength of a strong state, and the extent to which the UN had previously been